Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Miqueias Mugi. I'm an academic research manager here at the Brazil Lab. And the Brazil Lab is part of the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. Thank you all for joining us for today's colloquium, a very special one with a book launch. I want to begin by thanking our co-sponsors, the Department of Anthropology, the Program in Latin American Studies, the Program in African Studies, and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. Their support makes events like this one possible, and we are very grateful. It is a real pleasure to welcome my good friend and colleague, Ernesto Mané, back to Princeton. Ernesto is a Brazilian physicist, he's a diplomat, he's a writer. He earned his PhD at the University of Manchester and carried out postdoctoral research at Triumph in Canada and right here at Princeton when we met for the first time. Since 2014, Ernesto has served in the Brazilian Diplomatic Corps, where he has become internationally recognized for his work in nuclear physics and his contributions to global disarmament and scientific diplomacy. In 2025, Ernesto published his debut book, Antes do Início, Before the Beginning, a powerful account of traveling from Brazil to Guinea-Bissau to meet the paternal family he never knew. I was very lucky because I think I was one of the first readers of the first incarnation of this book back in 2020. The book is many things at once, and that I realized when I first read, and I know that it's a different book now. It is a memoir, a travel diary, and also an essay. It is a story about searching for what Ernesto calls his time zero, the point where a fractured life can begin again. And it's a searching reflection as well on the legacies of colonialism, on the diaspora, and what it means to belong. We are also very fortunate to have Professor Lilia Moritz-Schwartz with us today as our discussant. Lily, as many of you know, is professor of anthropology at the University of São Paulo and visiting professor here at Princeton. There are not many scholars better equipped than Lily to help us think through the questions that Antes do Início raises about race, identity, and the long afterlives of empire in the Lusophone world. Here is how we will proceed. Ernesto will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes. Lily will then offer her comments and questions, and after Ernesto has had a chance to respond, we will open the floor for questions from you. And a quick reminder, Ernesto has only a few copies of the book available and will be here after the event if you're interested in getting one and getting his signature. So without further ado, Ernesto, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be back. So today at lunch, I was at Science and Global Security lunch seminar with my colleagues, and we had some Asian food. I got a fortune cookie, and when I cracked it up, I got this message: "You will do great at your schoolwork today." So I hope that it comes true. So just a second. Yeah. So I will read what I prepared for today's presentation. Yeah. It is good to see so many friendly faces here in Princeton. Thank you very much, João, Pedro, Miqueias, Rodrigo, for the invitation to talk about my debut book. And thank you, Lily, for being here with me today as the discussant for this presentation. The last time I spoke here at Princeton, at the Brazil Lab, in this very room, was in 2020, when I presented my essay on cooperation and conflict inside and outside the Capoeira Roda. This essay was part of a collection of articles bundled together and submitted by young Brazilian diplomats to a magazine called Juca, related to our diplomatic academy. I wrote that essay in 2015, and when I presented it here in Princeton, I wanted to check whether some of the main arguments were still valid. And the jogo is still ongoing, right? I remember very well that the presentation took place a couple of weeks before the COVID pandemic struck the world, and we had to be socially isolated from each other. Brazil was being ruled by Bolsonaro, and the US by the first Trump administration. Today we're being governed by Lula, and the US is under the second Trump administration. The world is undergoing profound shifts in the way it works, and part of my job as a professional diplomat is to try to understand these changes and provide advice to decision makers back at home. But the reason I'm invited here today is to talk about my book, Antes do Início, or Before the Beginning in English, in which I retell the story of my reconnection with my African roots. The book is largely based on 2 travel diaries from 2010 and 2011, a time when I was not a diplomat, but a 27-year-old physicist who had recently finished defending his PhD in nuclear physics in Manchester and at CERN, the mecca of the field in Europe, and was doing a postdoc at a top national nuclear physics laboratory here in North America. During these years, while I was living my childhood dream of being a scientist, it grew in me a feeling of estrangement from what ended up becoming a full-time job. After some soul-searching, I realized that I was trained to investigate the origin of things, but at the same time, I did not know much about my own African roots. This estrangement stemmed from a profound contradiction that later developed into a painful existential crisis, and I knew I needed to address this pain. In December 2010, I took a trip to Guinea-Bissau to meet my father's side of the family. And in 2011, I traveled to India with my mother to attend a friend's wedding. On both occasions, I took a notebook with me where I tried to capture my observations, impressions, and reflections about the world. I was not used to writing personal diaries or journaling any of my experiences. My intellectual repertoire consisted of mathematics, computer programming, both theoretical and experimental physics, and an unrelenting curiosity about the world. But despite not being so well versed with the words, I felt compelled to do so because of my personal circumstances. I had recently gone through a painful divorce and was feeling a little bit lost. So this exercise in writing served to unlock my subjectivity and had a cathartic effect that is so much needed at that time. My parents got divorced when I was 7 years old, and my father did not keep in contact with us. As I grew up, I decided to learn about him and his side of the family. It was only after I finished my graduate studies that I was able to gather the material and subjective means to make this long-standing dream come true. So, the book tells the story of this journey of reckoning with my own past, alongside with my own reflections on contemporary race relations in Brazil and in other parts of the Black diaspora. Guinea-Bissau is a small country located in the west coast of Africa, sharing borders with Senegal to the north and with Guinea-Conakry to the south. I only got interested in finding its location on the world map in my late teens. The country was colonized by Portugal for over 4 centuries, and it declared its independence in 1973 after a fierce guerrilla war that started in the 1960s. I only seriously learned about the country's history in my adulthood. My father was part of the Air Force. He was a member of the Portuguese colonial army. Shortly after his country's independence, he, together with some other soldiers, was accused of collaborating with the colonial power and was persecuted as part of those purges that are typical of post-revolutionary periods. He managed to leave Guinea-Bissau in 1978 with a scholarship of the Brazilian Ministry of External Relations, my current employer, to study in Brazil. There he met my mother and he started a new life. In Brazil, my father studied economics at University of São Paulo, USP, one of the most prestigious universities in the country, where some of you have studied and our professors. He had classes with some of the best scholars of the time. Some of these professors either came to occupy public positions in the government or became influential figures in the design and implementation of economic policies. He told me that from day one, he felt very intimidated by that atmosphere. And again, my father was persecuted. This time, he was a victim of academic racism. And my father failed one of his professor's subjects several times until he lost his scholarship and was unable to finish his master's degree. My father's self-esteem was shattered, and I am convinced this episode significantly contributed to the collapse of my family. Because of my parents' separation, I did not know much about his old life on the other side of the Atlantic. For example, I did not know in detail the reasons that led my father to leave his country behind and to only go back there in 2008. That is, 30 years after he first left. I did not know much about my relatives there either. All I knew was that both his parents were still alive. Nor did I know anything about my siblings. He had several children before he went to Brazil. I spent about a month in Guinea-Bissau, but as you can imagine, the trip was intense. Like a sponge, I wanted to soak up everything around me, every color, taste, and smell. I felt the need to register all the stories I was told about the country, about my relatives, and of course, about my father. And I wanted to document everything with the pretense of the rigorous scientific objectivity I had been trading for several years in world-class physics laboratories. It was a unique opportunity, and I felt so lucky to have been able to make this return to Africa and meet my relatives still alive. When I come to think about the millions of descendants of the African diaspora who have lost the direct family connections with the continent, I realize that the story I documented in that travel diary transcended my individual story and touched the whole diaspora. Parts of the diary were written in English, actually. The most intimate parts, as some kind of self-protection mechanism. I feel I had to distance myself from my mother tongue to be fully comfortable expressing some of the deep feelings that had been silenced and buried in my subconscious due to the colonial trauma and the trauma of being abandoned by my father. To illustrate this point, I will read to you an unedited excerpt of a diary entry from December 18, 2010 that I wrote originally in English. Quote, in 2004, when I came back from England, I destroyed all photographs from my father that my mom still had with her. I could never understand why she kept them, and I thought it was my duty to release her. One of my biggest regrets in my life. I never told my father I did that. The diary was kept in a drawer for over a decade. Until 2020, I never touched it, reread it, or consciously thought about it in a persistent manner. From 2010 to 2020, my life underwent profound changes that involved returning to Brazil after many years abroad, a career transition from physics to diplomacy, a second marriage, this time round accompanied by fatherhood, and the death of my own father. These life events kept me busy, and I felt I had no time to reflect on how that trip had changed me. But deep down, these changes were in part all connected to that event. I'm here sharing space with an expert in dissecting images, paintings, photographs, you name it. And without knowing it, she became a character in my book. When I mentioned in the diary that I read an interview with her where she talks about racism in Brazil. Little did I know that a couple of years after the trip, I was going to study her books as part of my preparation to pass the Brazilian Foreign Service exam to become a diplomat. And I'm very proud to say that I got the highest grade in the history written exam Thank you, Lily. And you could guess my surprise when I met her in person here in Princeton at one of the many Brazil Lab seminars I attended when I did my second postdoc between 2019 and 2020. During that year, I did research on safeguards of nuclear naval propulsion and on non-intrusive methods for nuclear disarmament verification with Professor Alex Glaser and Professor Zia Mian, who are here with us today. That was an opportunity to get my brain back to do technical work in a world-class research environment. At the same time as my physics research here in Princeton, I started attending these Brazil Lab seminars. And those were the icing on the cake of that sabbatical year spent here. Somehow, the idea of writing this book is intimately connected with these seminars. And I would like to dedicate a few words to explain why. It was in one of the Brazil Lab seminars that I met Rodrigo Simon, then a doctoral student here in Princeton. Rodrigo happens to be a very good journalist. And I remember that when we introduced ourselves to each other, he became very intrigued by my background. Towards the end of my sabbatical, Rodrigo proposed to write a short article, esquina, or corner in English, about me to this Brazilian magazine called Piauí. These articles are usually a short bio of half a page of people who are considered to be of general public interest. And Rodrigo managed to convince his editor that my story was worth telling. His article was published in November 2020. Dos Átomos ao Itamaraty, from the atoms to Itamaraty, which is how we call the Brazilian Ministry of External Relations. And it had a good reception. I remember my friends and workmates writing to me about it. And of course I was excited with this publication of this esquina. But at the same time, I had a strange feeling of being somehow alienated from my own story. And I knew I could tell it in my own terms, controlling the narrative and expanding it way beyond the half a page of the esquina with the material I had from the trip I took to Guinea-Bissau in 2010-2011. The COVID pandemic itself was another driving force behind the publication of this book. Towards the end of my sabbatical here in Princeton in early 2020, I dedicated some of my time to write computer code to simulate the spread of the virus, based on early data on transmission rates, death rates, etc. I ran the simulations for the populations of Brazil and of the US, and I thought I had made a mistake somewhere in my code when it indicated that the number of deaths could have exceeded 1 million if nothing was done about it. The early measures taken by our countries were decisive for them to tally the highest number of deaths in absolute terms in the world. And that was also when I learned, in practical terms, the contemporary meaning of the term necropolitics, so well studied by Achille Mbembe. Sorry for this digression, but I want you to understand that what was happening on my mind when I decided to write this book. Simply put, it was the fear of imminent death that took us over that made me think about what kind of legacy I would like to leave behind. So I took the diary out of the drawer and began transcribing it into a Word file. After I had transcribed the diary notes to the computer, including the translation to Portuguese of the parts written originally in English, I went on to find a publisher. And then again, my friends here at the Brazil Lab were very helpful, as I did not have any idea of how this market works. Rodrigo and Miqueias were one of the first people to generously read the manuscript and give me positive feedback, which encouraged me to keep going. I guess anyone who is writing their first book will second guess oneself about whether the work is worth publishing. After some trials in 2020, I sent the manuscript to a fellow diplomat called Gustavo Pacheco. Gustavo is also a writer. and I had read his book on short stories called Alguns Humanos, Some Humans, published by Tinta da China Brasil, a small publishing house, which I liked a lot. Gustavo and I were not very close friends, but something told me that he would be an important ally to get the book published. Unfortunately, my intuition was right. Gustavo's reaction exceeded my expectations. He was very kind and generous. Not only did he appreciate the manuscript, but he offered to be my editor and to help find a publishing house. At the time, he was the co-editor of the Portuguese Granta magazine and suggested that I publish a fragment of the book there, which I did. It was published in 2023. It was volume 10, under the title Eu sou o outro do outro. I am the other of the other. In parallel, we began talks with Paulo Werneck from Associação 451, the main editor of Tinta da China Brasil. Paulo and Gustavo tried to convince me to include pictures of my trip in the book, which I refused. And I did so for two reasons. The first one, because I wanted the book to be based 100% in text, probably because of a preconceived notion, a wrong one, I now admit, that if it had images, it would have lost some of its literary appeal. The second reason had more to do with the people in Guinea-Bissau. During my trip, I took these many pictures, and as I write in the book, sometimes the locals were not comfortable with me taking pictures of them or of the surroundings. One of them even said to me that I was taking pictures of them to, quote, show them to the white people. So out of respect for them, I decided not to include them in the book. I have been learning a lot in the process of writing this book. I was initially a little bit too obsessed with the original text by treating it as a document, a piece of scientific data that could not be altered. But one very important lesson I learned in this process is that a literary text that will be published needs some rewriting. And I want to spend a few words on this aspect. A diary is an intimate piece of writing, and in most cases, it is not meant to be shared with the outside world. So, the editing process helped me to rewrite parts of the text in a way that it became more readable for another person that is not me. Another challenge was to keep the essence of the original text. After years working as a professional diplomat, our writing becomes more institutional, and I did not want this style to interfere with the diary entries of 2010. And the reader will see the difference in style throughout the text, mainly in relation to the more recent entries. The book has many layers and can be read with different perspectives in mind. But ultimately, it is a book that seeks to explore the intersections of colonialism and racism. One of my objectives was to denounce the effects of these two mechanisms that have operated across the Atlantic on the trajectory of a man, my father, his family, and by consequence, on my family and on me. I want to conclude with a few words about the book title, Before the Beginning. I was here in Princeton in 2019 when the physicist James Peebles was announced to have won half of the Nobel Prize in Physics for that year. I even attended the cocktail party made to celebrate his award. Professor Peebles' work relates to the history of the early universe. And this subject has always puzzled me because we know that contemporary cosmology is able to model the evolution of the universe after the beginning, the t equals 0, so to speak. But what happens before that time? What happens before the beginning? And I will read a short excerpt from the text from page 191 that I have translated back to English myself. Time is passing. This reality that I am living now will soon melt into memory, and only the notes of this diary will remain. I told people many of the stories I brought with me, and I will carry many others back. We found points of connection between African Africa and the Africa that exists on the other side of the Kalunga, a mirror that reflects the image from here. I wanted them to know that the seeds bore fruit in other lands and that they could take pride in that. My return to Africa was everything I wanted, every second of it. But then, what is a second? I thought about this all day long. The very word second is preceded by a first. And where is the first cause, the beginning of time, the t equals 0? This question continues to pursue me and makes me think deeply about the things I have written here so far. Time, transience, and permanence. I think I will stop here, and I would be very happy to answer questions from the audience. Thank you.
Oh, better like that. Don't know why. Good afternoon. Thank you, Brazil Lab, for this invitation. Thank you, the Department of Anthropology. And thank you, Miqueias, for this presentation, the second in 1 week, poor Miqueias. And thank you, Ernesto, for being here with us. I'm afraid I did not eat the fortune cookie, so I'm not very sure about my, my role here. And I have to say that Ernesto answered lots of my questions, and also that he selected the same passage that I selected, so I will be obliged to read it in Portuguese now. Well, the book, Before the Beginning, by Ernesto Mané, has many virtues. One of them is its refusal to be confined by easy genre definitions. A hybrid of memoir, autobiographical essay, and travel diary. The narrative dwells on what precedes, what comes before the beginning. That is, what exists prior to visible events, memories, silence, traumas, and expectations that shape subjects and relationships even before any official beginning. The story does not unfold as a traditional linear plot, but rather as a weaving of memories, reflections, and fragments. The past is summoned not as a static record, but as a contested field, something that can be reinterpreted, reworked, or even questioned. The book yet shifts the focus to what happens backstage. Instead of emphasizing major events, it privileges the subterranean moments that, once again, precede decisions and ruptures. Silence and the unspoken, what is not explicitly articulated, secrets, silence, carry fundamental weight in the narrative. They are elements of before the beginning. The concept of T equals 0, physics times 0, becomes a metaphor for the search for origins, for before the beginning. Ernesto adopts a reflective mode of writing. The language tends toward the essayistic, blending narrative with philosophical reflection on time, origin, memories. There is a constant mediation on being between words, Europe and Africa, and America, colonizer and colonized, personal memory, collective history. Mané addresses more directly his experience in Guinea-Bissau, The encounter with his family and with his origins oscillates between estrangement and profound identification. He revisits his trip to Guinea-Bissau between late 2010 and early 2011. The country still bears the marks of Portuguese colonization and of the War of Independence that ended in 1974, without losing, at least completely, its customs, religions, practice, and more traditional values. All of this calls upon the author to reflect on belonging, displacement, and identity. In this sense, before the beginning also acquires a historical meaning, referring to what precedes, again, the independent nation itself, and in parallel, what precedes once more the narrator's political consciousness. Projectively, the author also reflects on his father and on the importance of race. He does not seek to absolve anyone. I was very impressed by this. But to think of raciality as a defining element of biographies, silent biographies, traumatic biographies. The book thus articulates childhood, professional formation, personal life, extending even to his own fatherhood. Guinea-Bissau emerges as a kind of formative space. The country is not merely a setting, but structures the author's subjectivity. The colonial experience, racial and political tensions, and everyday local life shape his worldview. On page 14, he writes, now it's my translation, I'm very afraid about it, that packing my bags made me think that we are the result of memories, of memories, of memories. Arrumar as malas me faz pensar que somos o resultado de memórias, de memórias, de memórias. 3 pages later, he adds, memories is a curious thing. Memória é coisa engraçada. Ou, então, I'm going to read in Portuguese the same passage that I select. Meu retorno à África foi tudo que eu queria, cada segundo. Aliás, o que é o segundo? Pensei nisso hoje o dia inteiro. A própria palavra segundo é precedida por primeiro. E onde está a causa primeira? O início do tempo. O T igual a 0. Essa pergunta continua me perseguindo e me faz pensar profundamente nas coisas que escrevi. A temporalidade, a transitoriedade, a permanência. I therefore have a few questions about memory, recording, and archive. But some of them you had already answered. But even so, as a very stubborn person, I'm going to ask again. The first one, I think you know. Why do you mention photography so many times? I know you gave us an explanation, but it's very impressive, the quantity of passages that you, when you refer that you took photographs or that you did not want to take them, that others ask you to take them, and that others ask you not to take them. It seems photography haunts you. Yet, it does not receive a formal registration in your personal and now public archive. Why did it remain concealed? I think it's more. It's not just your explanation. I guess it's more. I would also like you to elaborate a bit more on your very important reflection on color. You write, I have been in this country for 10 days, and I have the feeling that I will find it strange to see white people again. Yet, I realize that people consider me white. They say I dress differently. On the other hand, in my perception, they also dress like white people, just in a different kind of clothing. Go figure. Now in Portuguese. because Pedro is here. If I'm not going to read in Portuguese, he will be mad with me. Já estou nesse país há 10 dias e tenho a sensação de que vou estranhar ver gente branca de novo. No entanto, percebi que as pessoas me consideram branco. Falam que eu me visto diferente. Por outro lado, na minha percepção, eles também se vestem como brancos, só que com outro tipo de roupa. Vai lá entender. Okay, my question is, does this way of negotiating colors remind you of Brazil? Are there continuities in this language of color? Third question. The trip, brief in calendar time, is very long in memory. Why did you not return? Fear, insecurity, a past that keeps rescinding. And if you would go back, do you think you would write a different book? Fourth, finally, as a diplomat by training, did your view of Guinea-Bissau change? Or did Guinea-Bissau change your view as a diplomat? And what about physics? Did your stay in Guinea-Bissau change your Western perception about time and space? In short, your book seems to be your Calunga Grande. Balanta is your origin and derives from the idea of amber. I think Guinea-Bissau set your origins ablaze. The Mané people were brought to the United States because of their expertise in cultivating rice and flooded lands. Mané were wise men, a wise man who came from the Mali Empire. Yet in Brazil, as you explained, Mané means the opposite, a fool person, otário. So few words and so many meanings. In this initiatory journey, I believe you were adapted, just as your son did when he spoke to you about Black Science Day, Dia da Ciência. He meant Dia da Consciência Negra, Black Consciousness Day, but he said Black Science Day. But deep down, he was right. Thank you for this fundamental reading, and on a personal note, thank you for including me in your memoirs. I am there on page 57, a very important year for me. I was deeply moved. I felt a kind of honored Balanta. Thank you so much.
Okay, so it's my turn to answer these brilliant questions from Professor Lily. I'll try. I wrote them down. If I get lost here, please remind me some of the questions. I wrote them how I could. The first question relates to photography, right? So I love photography. I like taking pictures. Maybe I'm a frustrated photographer. I don't know. But as I do write in the book, I wanted to register everything. And I know that photography is a very powerful way to do that. But also I know now, more than at the time, that it is not an innocent practice. So I was a little bit afraid of the way I was photographing people, how I was sort of like projecting these colonial views, because in their own words, I came from the land of the white people. For them, Brazil is considered to be the land of white people. And I will elaborate a little bit on that. So I of course, I've looked at these pictures again, and by looking at them, it just confirms some of my fears that maybe my view was indeed contaminated by some of these colonial attitudes, which also answers part of your question about how you are being perceived as being white, even though I don't have a white skin color. So it explains a little bit what it means to be white, in a sense. And there is another thing that I didn't put in the book, but my father, he traveled to Guinea-Bissau in 2008, and he also took pictures. And before he passed away, I managed to get his pictures, a copy of them. And it is an interesting exercise to kind of compare his perspective of his own country and how I also portrayed the country when I visited it. But at this stage, I decided not to include them in this book. I don't think I was ready, I was ripe for doing that step. But the pictures are there. So, and actually, in the poster of the presentation, there is one picture that I shared with Micaeus about a woman in a canoe. That's near the backyard of my grandparents' house. So that's, I don't think that's a very bad picture. So the thing about color, yeah, Brazil and Africa, yeah, I was shocked when some people, and mostly kids, were pointing fingers at me and saying, "Look at the white man out there." And I was like, "But you know, I grew up in Brazil, and I'm sure I'm not white." And then it took me a while to, you know, after some reflecting on this, to realize that, you know, the way I was dressing, behaving, I was with a camera, digital camera, you know, a money pouch, boots. I was looking like a colonial explorer, basically. And that is to be white, basically. So I don't know if that answered the question. It is an attitude, right? It relates to power, to financial means, right? I mean, Guinea-Bissau, it is one of the poorest countries in the world, one of the, you know, lowest indicators, social, you know, health, you name it. Actually, I do invite you to check what the current Secretary of Health here is actually doing in Guinea-Bissau right now. Is testing some vaccines over there. So there is a New York Times article about it written by a woman called Khadija Mané, who is probably a relative of mine. So this article is recent. It's in the New York Times. So yeah, and in terms of Brazil, of course, we have many gradations of skin color. You know, this description about race in Brazil is very much more subjective than here in the United States. Again, I'm not like a theoretician or an expert. I don't want to elaborate on like the theory of colorism or any of that, but I don't think that I was being read as a white person by some people there because of my skin color. There are many different ethnicities in Guinea-Bissau, and by comparing me with some of them, my tone wasn't that much lighter than theirs. So, oh, and of course I didn't mention I was wearing dreadlocks at the time, right? And I was the only person walking around with dreadlocks, and so that probably also, you know, your body image also conveys a message, right? So, I think that probably exhausts the second question. So the third question, why I did not return. That is also a very good one, Lily, and you probably pointed out to some of the reasons, and I would say that it's probably all of them together. Most people who were described in the book actually passed away. My both grandparents, some uncles, aunts, and the ones who did not pass away moved to Europe, mostly to Lisbon. So the people are no longer there. So if I go back, you know, It's going to be a different experience altogether. And right now, also, the country underwent a very sort of difficult political moment. Let's put it this way, and I have to have some also responsibility when I talk about what is happening there now, because now I'm also a citizen of Guinea-Bissau. I applied for my nationality back in 2022. So, so when you become a citizen of a country, you have certain rights and responsibilities. So I'll just leave it like that, you know. And then now you asked about, as a diplomat, if my view about Guinea-Bissau changed and how Guinea-Bissau changed me, right, somehow. I think that trip was 1 year before I decided to return to Brazil and to study, to apply, to enter the Brazilian Foreign Service. So that trip was actually transformational in many senses. I didn't know very much the details about you know, the circumstances that led my father to leave Guinea-Bissau in the late 70s, and only later did I find out that he came with a scholarship from my current employer. And that's quite an irony of you know, history. He was a student of PEC-G. It's a program that initiated in the 60s, right? So maybe I can spend some time talking about this, because that's when I actually realized I became a product of Brazilian foreign policy even before I was born. So in the 60s, Brazil, with Jânio Quadros, started his independent foreign policy doctrine, PEI, Política Externa Independente. And part of that involved getting closer to the new independent countries after World War II in Africa and Asia. And part of that story, actually, I was telling Rodrigo, is connected with the appointment by Jânio of the first black Brazilian to become ambassador to an African country, to Ghana, who was at the time the first country to become independent. And this Brazilian man, Raimundo de Souza Dantas, right, he went there, and actually he wrote a memoir about his experience in the African country, in Ghana. His book is called África Difícil, or Difficult Africa. It's going to be republished shortly, I think. So, and it is interesting to reflect upon that, because this independent foreign policy, Brazil, before announcing that change in doctrine, basically was almost fully aligned with the United States. And when Jânio declared this independence from, you know, this pattern of alignment, in concrete terms, he wanted Brazil to have a universalist foreign policy. And the appointment of this black diplomat, who wasn't a career diplomat, is the realization of this policy. And I think that is significant. And as you well know, the former Portuguese colonies in Africa, they only become independent in the 70s. So that was the last wave of independence, right? And Guinea-Bissau, for instance, I was telling people the other day, it's considered to be the Vietnam of Africa. The independence war was very difficult, was a fierce guerrilla war. Napalm was used. Portugal at the time was already a NATO country and was also supported by NATO. And on the other hand, Guinea-Bissau was being supported by the Soviet Union, by Cuba, and the context of the Cold War was basically the backdrop against which my father was sent to Brazil, because Brazil was offering scholarships because it wanted to attract some of these young Africans from these recent independent countries to shape and influence them, so that when they returned to their countries, they would be part of the political elites running the country, and they would be more, you know, say, closer to Brazil and Brazilian values and worldviews. I mean, this is a classic, right? So many countries do that. So I didn't know any of that. So it's part of my studies as a diplomat. So I see that very clearly. Wow, this is like a foreign policy operation, in a way. The thing is that my father never returned. So, I mean, he passed away in Brazil. So he didn't return to become part of the government. And he had his own differences, and he didn't agree with the way things were happening there. And but most of his colleagues from his generation did return, and they did take positions in many different parts of the government. Some of them even become diplomats. So, and I think I answered that question. And then the next question was about physics, right? How the trip changed my view on physics. So this has to do with the way I've been trained with Western science, and this worldview, basically, I didn't completely shake it off, you know. That's part of who I am. But I wanted to see different ways to see and feel the world, to explain the world, different epistemic views. And yes, my trip to Guinea-Bissau did change the way I think about time, and I think about space, of course. That I think about recurrence and some concepts that you see even in mathematics changed, you know. Now I do teach my kids some games, some African games, and they are highly mathematical, and it's very nice to learn and to teach them at the same time, and to see that there's some very interesting knowledge produced before, you know, time, or before the contact with Europe, or, you know, with the West. And even to say that Africa also had a very fundamental role in the inauguration of what is considered to be the Western thought. Like if you look at Egypt and all the Greeks that actually studied in Egypt, just like, you know, people get a scholarship to study abroad, some Greeks were like studying in Egypt, learning mathematics and philosophy. And then they went back to Greece and wrote about, you know, their theorems, saying that this was all invented by them. So about Mané, a fool, that's, you know, again, you know, but the thing is, in my home state in Brazil, Paraíba, that is a little bit less of a problem than if you go to Rio or São Paulo. But Rio de Janeiro, I mean, Mané is something very problematic. Yeah. But yeah, that kind of like accompanied me, and it was I was a little bit under a stigma for carrying this name, and going to Guinea-Bissau and to be able to sort of like give a new meaning to my own name also reshaped my new identity that I was actually looking to develop out of that trip. And I think I answered everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Black Science Day.
Yeah, the Black Science Day.
So we have 30 minutes for Q&A with Ernesto, and maybe we can collect.
Can I sit here?
Yeah, you can sit here. And then we can collect like bundles of trees so more people can speak. Who would like to start? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I was very interested in you mentioning the academic racism that your father experienced, and I wondered to what extent that resonated for you when you embarked on an academic career, to what extent you experienced racism inside the academy, if at all. I mean, I'm thinking both in Europe, in Manchester, and in the United States.
See ya.
Yeah, Ernesto, thank you. You mentioned going to India. You mentioned it once, and then everything else is about Guinea-Bissau and Portugal and Brazil and so on. So tell me about India. What color are you in India?
Pedro.
Yeah, but they don't.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to have you back here. I was thinking as I was paging through the book and listening to you about that beautiful documentary, you may know it, by Patricio Guzman, Nostalgia de la Luz, Nostalgia of Light, in which basically you have this scene in which the mothers are in the Atacama Desert looking for the bodies, the corpses of their relatives, their husbands, their children, that were buried there by the dictatorship in anonymous places. And then you have the gigantic telescopes there, and the scientists looking at the past in the sky, because whenever you look at the sky, you're looking, I mean, best case scenario, you're seeing something from 4 years ago in the case of the closest star. And this is just an excuse to ask you to please elaborate more on Lily's third question about you as a scientist, because I would love to hear you about the scientist who is a writer of memories here. I mean, how much, because for almost, possibly for many, or if not the majority of us here, this whole thing about the past and the sky would be, in the best case scenario, a metaphor. But in your case, it seems there's something more. There's physics there in memory, in image, in past, and in time. So tell us, what's the magic here?
I'm glad you asked this question as well, Pedro. Okay, let me start. So, onto your question about academic racism. Can you hear me, or should I go back? The mic is on, yeah. On academic racism. Maybe I didn't mention. I should have mentioned it somewhere, but it's a good opportunity to do so. My name is Ernesto Mané Jr. Yeah. Ernesto Mané is the name of my father. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. And what this meant to me as I was growing up, I was always being compared to him by my mother and by my mother's side of the family. I come from a biracial family, I have to say. They are white, Brazilian white, so to speak. So I've always been compared to him, even though he left the house and abandoned us. So I was compared to somebody I didn't know very much. And I knew some stories, some fragments about him. And I knew a little bit about this story at the University of São Paulo. My father was friends with Kabengele Munanga, who is an anthropologist from Congo, a professor in São Paulo. So they were contemporaries there. I have a story about him that I'll tell later. But so knowing that my father had this academic sort of mishap because of racism, that was also something that has always dreaded me, always. And my father, when he left the house, I was 7, and I've reconnected with him when I was 20. And I did so because I was leaving my home the first time to study in Manchester, in England. And then I searched for him to ask for advice. Like, please, I'm going to do the same you did, leaving your home country, going abroad. Can you please give me some advice? Because I didn't want to end up in the same situation that he got, you know. So that's when we started having a conversation and we reconnected. To answer your question, when I was in England, in Manchester, doing my PhD, it was a very, say, eventful time of my life. I was like very young, so I did my undergrad, my exchange year when I was 20, from 20 to 21. Then I returned to the UK to do my PhD when I was 22. So I was still very young and unexperienced about the world. And so there was always this tension about like identity, who I was, and the type of knowledge I was learning, I was being taught, right? And I was afraid of failing like my father did, right? So I remember my first seminar when I was speaking there as a grad student. I couldn't even stand up because my legs were shaking, like so much, like jelly, you know. I was really afraid, and that feeling accompanied me until the very end, until I defended my PhD, because, well, in Brazil and I think here in the U.S., when you're a PhD student, you take your credits, then you do your work, and the viva or the defense is an important ritual. But if you get that to that point, you're very likely going to pass. That's not the case in England. And actually, the defense is behind closed doors. It's only you, and not even your advisor is allowed to enter the room. So I was under that fear until the very end, right? And when I defended my PhD, I took the certificate, and I wanted it to be recognized in Brazil. And the university I chose to do that was the University of São Paulo. I took it there, and with my grades, with my marks, and it got approved. So I have my doctoral degree recognized by this university that did that to my father, and I did feel vindicated by that. I think I answered part of your question. And of course, I mean, the relationship with my peers in Europe, in England. I was doing my research at CERN in Geneva, and an international collaboration with people from many different countries. That was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot from it. It was good. Now about India, Zia. You're asking this question, so how I was seen in India. I don't know if I was seen as an exotic man because I had my dreadlocks. And they were taking pictures of me all the time, right? And I think they have like a holy man in the sadhus, the sadhu babas, right? Who give up on everything, and then they live a life of I don't know. I think some of them, they even become like homeless people, just beg on the streets. So, but of course, I wasn't like dressed up as a homeless person. So people were like, kind of like, "Are you a holy man?" And they were taking pictures. So it was an interesting sort of exchange, because of course I was also taking pictures of them. But one reason I do mention this trip to India in the book has to do with, well, I did mention that to you yesterday. So I went to an Indian wedding in Goa. That used to be also a Portuguese colony. But I also took the chance to travel to other parts of India, Mumbai, New Delhi, and including Varanasi, the holy city there. And I was like hypnotized, sitting there watching, the people being cremated. So that was, those rituals, they were like something that caught my attention a lot. And I remember sitting there like for hours watching the whole process. And my father, when he passed away, he was also cremated. But that's not something common to Africans. Africans don't cremate their people. It's something to be disputed whether or not, because he never told me that he wanted to be cremated. So the decision was made. But one thing I know is that the people from his side of the family in Africa, they were completely appalled. They were in shock, and they still do not accept that this was the fate that was left for him. So, this thing about being cremated and this trip to India was something. This images, seeing the ashes and all those images were very, very strong in my mind. And I do mention some of the things that I don't want to give spoilers in the book, but India was also something very important for me. And Pedro, this is one of my favorite films, Nostalgia de la Luz. I love it, absolutely. And I'm so glad you asked this question because you're absolutely right. I mean, there is like this paradox that at one hand, people are like searching for the remains of their loved ones in the desert, right? That during the Chilean dictatorship, actually the regime ordered these big machines, these bulldozers and these machines, to revolve the earth so that it would spread the bones and make it more difficult for these people to be identified. And at the same time, at the Atacama Desert is one of the best spots on earth to observe the skies, right? And what I find beautiful about this film is that it's kind of like you're searching for the past, but at different time scales. Right. And there is actually a third thing in that film that I remember well, that there were like archaeologists also looking for ancient civilization from 10,000 years ago. So all these three different time scales coexist in that space. And that film is one of my favorite films, and I watched it when I was living in Canada before going to Guinea-Bissau. So perhaps in my subconscious I was being informed about that film, and in my writing that thing kind of like caused an impression on me. So absolutely there is a relationship there between the film and not the film, yeah, the film and my writing. Yeah, so that was good, yeah.
Okay, João.
Okay, thank you so much, Ernesto. What a joy to have you back here. I have the book. I've not read it yet, so maybe I am asking for some spoilers. So,
Yeah.
But thank you for this rich conversation and presentation. Many times, your father is such a strong figure, right? But also you as a father in the process, right? And then the figure of the child, you as a child, abandoned child, you as a father, your children. So there's some, if you could tell a little bit more, how do you navigate this figure of the child? And how do you kind of recuperate this figure to be able to assess it in your perception somehow? And I think that's linked with the other question, the other side of that question. Which imagination people had of you? Did they know of your existence, your relatives? And which imagination they had? You mentioned how people saw you as white, but I'm just curious, your grandparents, your siblings, and how was it to be faced with their imagination of you?
Okay, that's also one more.
Yeah, Lucas.
Lucas.
Thank you, Ernesto. It's great to have you back here and to continue learning from you. And I'm curious about the book in relation to new or the next generation of diplomats, because I also haven't had the opportunity to read yet. But I see that listening to you now, I see your life has a lot of cycles in terms of history, right? Like you, your dad, and everything else. Many quote-unquote coincidence and things coming back. And then you mentioned also that when studying for the tests for Itamaraty, you were reading, among other things, books from Lily, right? So I can totally imagine, like in the near future, your own book being there. So could you talk a little bit more, please, about these possible lessons for new, younger diplomats that your book, the topics of your book might prompt? Thank you.
Okay.
And then Zizi.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I really liked your reflections on photography because I'm very passionate about street photography. And every time I'm shooting, I'm wondering, is this right? Like, for who am I shooting? Is it okay to take this picture? And I wanted then to ask you, if you were to come back to Guinea-Bissau, what would you do differently, like with photography? Do you think there's a way to use photography not as like a tool for Western eye, for the Western eye, or for example, more as a personal journal for you? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Let's go. Yeah. I mean, I didn't come all the way from Buenos Aires, right? For nothing. So might as well to make the most of it. Child, right, and imagination. João. Okay. I will try to answer your question, and also I will combine with Lucas's aspects of Lucas's question. I mean, going back to this thing about, I was always compared with my father, right? And of course, he wasn't a good father after he left. When he was at home until I was 7, he was actually a very good father, right? Probably better than I was when my kids were like 7. Because he was present. He was doing his studies, he was doing his master's in São Paulo. I grew up at CRUSP. Yeah, these residents, for students in São Paulo. And my mother was working, and he stayed home studying and taking care of me. So he was giving me food, changing diapers, all that. So he was a super father, super dad. And then when my parents divorced, it was also very traumatic. And then he disappeared. And it has always puzzled me why he did that. And he didn't go back to Africa, he didn't change cities, he stayed just in a different neighborhood. But why, right? And being such a present father. And I was always being compared with him, and when I became a father, I was like, well, I need to be a different father. I need to be present. And so, for instance, my oldest son, he is going to turn 11 now in April, and the youngest one, he's 6. So I do these mental calculations, like, the older one, I've been a father for him and present in his life longer than my father was. So I'm constantly comparing myself to my father, as I have my own kids. And this puts some pressure as well, in the exercise of fatherhood. But it is a wonderful experience, And sometimes I also have my own sort of like, my own questions, because when I approached my father in my 20s, because I wanted to take some advice from him, when I moved abroad, my mother, she was outraged. She felt betrayed because she was the one who raised us without him. And, Brazilian mothers, single mothers, they're like, I was the father, I was the mother, and I was the father. Why are you now, looking for him? And I was like, yeah, you were a very good mother, but you were not my father, there is a gap there, there is a hole, there's a void I need to fill, right? And there's also this thing about being a child of a biracial relationship, and he being the reference that is missed, from my African ancestry. So I do try, for instance, I read, stories from Africa. I play games from Africa with my kids. They know very well where Guinea-Bissau is in the map. So they know all the the Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa. So in that sense, I try to put in their imagination that they are also part of the story that connects us to Africa. For instance, they've met my grandmother, their great-grandmother, before she passed away. Like I said, some of my relatives went to Portugal, they moved to Europe. So although I didn't go back to Guinea-Bissau, but I've always been in contact with them because it was back and forth, traveling to Europe, sometimes meeting them. And my kids, they met some of their relatives from Africa, something I didn't have the chance to. right? And there is another thing about imagination. Because I first met some of my relatives, my aunt, my father's sister, and some of my cousins in Europe when I was doing my PhD. And I remember, I think that was like back in 2008 or something. I didn't know how they looked like. I didn't have pictures of them. And they set up to pick me up at the airport. So when I got off, the arrivals, pick my luggage. When I go out, to wait and see, we instantly recognized each other by the smile. We looked the same. So that was a beautiful moment. They knew about my existence. And they were always very proud to have, one of them that became a scientist and now is a diplomat, So this is something that, and now that wrote this book, everybody in Guinea-Bissau knows about this book. So, and they are very happy about it. And yeah, I said I was going to connect these coincidences of child, and we've looked at this question. So this is another weird coincidence, right? My son, my oldest son, he was doing like schoolwork last year. I didn't have that when I was a child, at his age. Now they are writing about their own personal stories, histories, from their relatives. They not just make a tree, but they also, learn about their ancestors, and then they have to interview their parents to write an account of their own personal histories. So he was asking me about how I met his mother, right? And this was an interesting thing because we met in Brasilia when I went back to Brazil to study for the Foreign Service exam. And guess what? I got a scholarship from the Ministry of External Relations. I was part of this affirmative action program. And that was the reason that I returned to Brazil. I was living abroad. So this scholarship brought me back to Brazil, to Brasilia, where I met his mother. Just like my father, he got a scholarship as well from the Ministry of External Relations, and then he met my mother. So, so this is how life goes. It's like cycles of repetition, right? Of rhymes and repetitions. Lucas, how this book will, this story will resonate with young diplomats or candidates, people who want to become diplomats. I've been mentoring some young African Brazilians or black people that want to become diplomats. And I hope that through this story they also become, inspired to continue pursuing their dreams and to join the Foreign Service and to represent Brazil. Because at the end of the day, one of the main functions of a diplomat is to represent the country. And what is the face of Brazil that we want to project, right? And in terms of photography, the question, I'm trying to remember here, maybe you can help me. There is a film from this guy, Karim Ainous. What's the name of the film?
He goes back to Algeria.
He goes back to Algeria. So that's the thing. This guy, he's Algerian, Brazilian, from Ceará, right? When I wrote this book, somebody said, oh yeah, you have to see this film. And then I went on and found out the film and I watched it. Did you find the name? Marinheiro. Marinheiro.
I'm going to find it.
Yes. So, and that's the funny story. This guy, his father was Algerian, and his mother was Brazilian. They met here in the U.S. His father, at the end of the Algerian Independence War, he got a scholarship. Then he came here to the U.S. And then his mother was also a researcher, and then they fell in love. And yeah, the mariner of the mountains. Yeah. Very good. So, so this guy, his mother got pregnant, and then his father left. So he didn't have the chance to meet his father, and then he became a filmmaker, And then he traveled to Algeria. years later, in his mid-50s. Right? The first time he went there. He was already like a grown-up man. And then he shot a film. He made a documentary about his experience. His father was no longer there, so he was talking to some people, some distant friends and relatives. So it was a different experience, but again, something about reconnecting, right, with the roots. And there is a passage in the film that resonated with me, and that's why I'm talking about this. He was shooting people in the streets in this small village. It was not in the capital where his family come from. So these people from this village, they also felt very uncomfortable with him shooting, films and filming them, and then he explains to them, look, my name is Karem Aynuz, I'm the son of this man, blah blah blah. He comes from this village, and then something changed. The people felt very happy, and then they wanted to be filmed, and they invite him to go and drink coffee, and it's a beautiful experience. And I also experienced that when I was in Guinea-Bissau. Of course, I wasn't shooting a film, but I was taking pictures. And the moment, but these things are related, right? So the moment, I do tell my story where I come from, that I'm actually the son of this man, and I'm a Balanta as well from this ethnic group. The relationship changed completely. They were very receptive, very open. They smiled for the pictures. But I did tell them, look, these pictures, I want them because this is part of who I am. You are part of who I am. Like, I need to sort of, it's like an anthropophagical, huh? It's something, I don't know how to translate that, this concept of anthropophagia. I needed to sort of like,
Eat something
to absorb, to appropriate this to rebuild my own identity. So it wasn't something predatory. You see what I mean? And they understood that. And this was the outcome of this negotiation and this relationship that we built when I was there, right?
Thank you so much for being here with us, for delivering such a wonderful talk, and for giving us Antes do Índice.